So without further ado, good morning. We'll try to stick to our time and the agenda that we have. We want to keep it as freewheeling as possible. Just to set the context, entrepreneurship is something that everybody speaks about. In my last role, I ran this organization which had over 500 startups. And there's one thing that startups and entrepreneurs bring to the table, and I'm going to test it out. Let's get this going. So I would love it if you guys can give a bit of an introduction to yourselves and what you guys do in the context of entrepreneurship, and we'll see how we stitch it together as far as unleashing economic growth is concerned. So we'll start with Rebecca and then go forward to PK.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Kumar. I'm the founder and director of 47. We are an omni-channel jewelry brand, and we launched the brand about 4 years ago online. And it's been a great journey. I've been living in India for about 13 years now, and I wanted to start something that helped me to shed the feeling of being a foreigner and kind of dig my own roots here. And jewelry and accessories are just a passion of mine. And it kind of brought to life my entire experience as an engineer and as an e-commerce product and brand manager. So it's a great opportunity. It was a great market opportunity and a space for us to kind of build something unique, that a Make in India brand that I thought would be special not only for the Indian community but for the rest of the world.
Yeah, PK Agarwal. My current role that I'm phasing out of is the Regional Dean and CEO of Northeastern Silicon Valley, which is a campus, Silicon Valley campus of Boston-based Northeastern University. I call myself an accidental academic because Northeastern is very bold and they wanted to treat university as a startup, especially if you're in Silicon Valley. You know, you want to do things in a hurry and be innovative and all that. But prior to that, I had the pleasure of being the global CEO of TIE. I'm sure most of you know TIE, Indus Entrepreneurs. And that was a phenomenal experience. It's an ultimate combination of Indian intellect and American money. I mean, it's a perfect of two worlds. And then before that, just to kind of keep the progression, I've been in CXO roles in the tech sector. I was the Chief Technology Officer for State of California, working for 5 years for none other than the Terminator. And so that's kind of a little bit of my last three things here.
Sure. Since 2010, I've worked with social entrepreneurs. My previous organization, we funded about 200 of them working across the country on problems in health, education, agriculture, livelihoods, energy. Currently at Stanford, we work on helping entrepreneurs and SMEs transform their businesses and grow. We've worked with about 100 entrepreneurs so far in the last year or so that we've been in operation.
My name is Ramesh Jagannathan. I'm also an accidental academic. I spent 30 years at Eastman Kodak Company. I've been there from the glory days to dog days, so I understand how corporations should not do things, you know. And my basic philosophy in my life is that I should reinvent myself every 5 years. Having worked in a multinational corporation, I was able to do that. I worked in various business units and departments, starting from research, manufacturing, supply chain, logistics, open innovation, technology scouting, and so on, all around the world. So, and then after 30 years, I got a call to join NYU Abu Dhabi, which I call a grand experiment. I was asked to join NYU Abu Dhabi because, my specialty used to take abstract ideas and concepts and pull global teams together and deliver tangible products and technologies in a short time frame. And Abu Dhabi government, UAE, were turning towards knowledge economy, and they wanted me to join and build NYU Abu Dhabi. I joined as associate dean, a professor, and then I'm the vice provost for innovation entrepreneurship, and recently raised $8 million from the government, and I run this program called Start AD. The main purpose of the program is to help facilitate the transfer to knowledge and entrepreneurial economy of the UAE and the region.
Thanks a lot, folks. Just to set the context as to why I think startups are going to be an amazing part of the catalytic growth in India, let me just give you some numbers. As of last year, about a little south of $14 billion went into startups to capitalize them to try and solve fundamental issues that obviously this country is mired with. But what's fascinating is that in a span of half a decade, India has become the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. To give context to that, the IT and IT enabling services has generated about $160 billion in revenue, and it took them 26 years. By 2025, $500 billion is the contribution by about 100,000 startups into the Indian economy. And that gives you a sense of why this is important. I wanted to touch upon one key aspect, and given that at least 3 of you dabble with academia to some degree, and I think our speakers in the previous panel spoke about it, can you guys touch upon the role that the academic infrastructure plays or does not play in the context of unleashing entrepreneurship?
I think I want to build upon what some of our plenary speakers like Shashi and they talked about. So the way we are approaching, and this is in context of my accidental academic role, is that we have to, like any startup, you have to differentiate yourself. So ultimately, we said there's 2 things that are happening in terms of the entrepreneurship, that you have to create the innovation mindset. But before that, you have to deal with the question of employability. Are you employable? So structurally, the way we took this approach, we said, look, there's 3 legs to a stool. You have education that's highly aligned with the needs of the industry, so you have constant communication with the industry. But the second thing is you have to have strong soft skills. And the third piece is obviously to have a connection network, preferably a global network, starting with the alums and the local industry. And all of this with the underlayment of innovation. So that's how we sort of feel like how we have taken this. And we obviously, like any American university, we have a lot of Chinese students and Indian students, and we find them highly structured. So part of it is not just assimilation, but part to break out of that mindset. We all realize that, and one of the things I've learned is that in the Indian context, much of this, if you're going to unleash entrepreneurship and economic growth, you have to start very early. It's not about the Flipkarts and the Amazons of the world, it's all about micro entrepreneurs. That's where the action is going to be.
Sure. So, there was some research that was done on the pattern of distribution of entrepreneurs across micro, small and medium, and large. And the difference between high per capita income economies and low per capita income economies is the high per capita income economies had been able to grow the base of small and medium enterprises, those that are employing between 50 to 500 and 1,000 people. So how do you get the startups really to get big? And I don't think at that stage you can teach entrepreneurship. So what we've learned at Stanford is you have to give entrepreneurs an opportunity to pause and reflect on their business, stimulate their thinking, their bold, ambitious vision, try and facilitate the percolation of that vision through the rest of their organization, because if they're not able to take the next 2 layers of management with them, they're never going to transform. Facilitate peer learning, because they learn better from each other than you can ever help. And then finally, to really help them with networks and connections that you might have access to as an academic institution. You can't teach entrepreneurship at that stage, but you can really facilitate them being much better and them pausing and plotting the next 10x growth once they've got to $2-3 million in revenue. How can they get to 50? How can they get to 100?
I think to pick up on what Sri Ganapathy has said, entrepreneurship is a lifestyle. That's the way I look at it, okay? And I'll use 2 types of explanations as to how I approach entrepreneurship in the university systems. As a data point, in the last 10 years or so, the number of university-based accelerators and incubators have gone up by a factor of, I think, 5 to 10, somewhere in there, okay? So that is the reality on the ground. So when we started NYU Abu Dhabi, when I was asked, I was supposed to sort of lead the innovation mindset, okay? So we did a lot of things, but one thing that I, sort of pulled together is that when you look at a 21st century university, right? You need to sort of look at what kind of competencies the students who go through the programs have. In the 20th century, you went to college, acquired a set of competency in a particular discipline of choice, right? But that is so 20th century. In the 21st century, in the globalized, connected world, I believed, and we instituted it in the engineering division and college-wide, also I'll tell you a little bit more about that, is that we need 3 sets of competencies. 1, in the chosen field of study, whatever it is. And 2, you need cultural competency, right? Because in a connected world, you are interacting with people of various cultures and sensibilities and all that. And that skill set is essential. In the US, traditionally, you either went to the, liberal arts school or you went to the non-liberal arts colleges, right? So they operated in silos. In the 20th century, let's not look back on it, right? In the 21st century, they need to be integrated, right? So in Envoy Abu Dhabi, we said that we need to give them the liberal arts education. So every student who went through, who's going through, the undergraduate curriculum in Envoy Abu Dhabi for the first 2 years takes the same curriculum, the liberal arts curriculum. They have to have it, so that they become very well-versed and competent in cultural competency. The third thing, which we instituted in the engineering division, is that you need to have a social accountability in the connected world, because whatever you do or you don't do has a major impact, whether it is positive or negative, especially in the entrepreneurial sense, right? So, see, what we said is that, I've been in the US for over 45 years, but America is great, but one thing what they do, is that they tend to be very prescriptive. They tend to think that they can tell the world how they should live, right? So in the connected world, that's not going to work, right? So we said that the learning has to happen not just on campus, but it has to also happen on the field. So we create the social, so we created a field lab. So where we take the students and they live with the people on the ground. We work with an organization like Habitat for Humanity. We build houses, but the process is not about building houses. It's communicating, living, playing, doing hard work with people who you don't even speak the same language. You observe, and so we then, break up into teams afterwards and figure out and learn from them as to how they manage the lifestyle with limited resources, right? So these are the 3 competency pillars that Envoy Abu Dhabi we give. It's a very entrepreneurial way of doing it, right? And then we connect it with a platform of innovation. So that is one of the ways we do, this thing. But I'll come back to you afterwards about the other aspects of what we do.
I wanted to touch upon one key attribute, and I think you will be a great exponent of this, given that you're actually running a startup. But before I do that, a quick show of hands, how many of you here are entrepreneurs? How many want to be entrepreneurs? Okay. How many of you invest in entrepreneurs? Great. And the rest of you, I'm assuming, work for some entrepreneur who was once an entrepreneur.
How many of you can spell entrepreneur?
Which is great. So here's the attribute that I want to throw out there.
I'm reminded of George Bush. Entrepreneurship.
And I'm going to start with a quote of arguably one of the greatest basketball players of all time, Michael Jordan. And he said, as opposed to all the successes I've had, I've missed 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost 300 games, and 26 times I was given the game-winning shot, and I failed. I've failed, I've failed, I've failed again, and that is why I succeed. So that's a key attribute in entrepreneurship. And in a society like India, failure is taboo. Right? So can you touch upon, either your life experiences or what you guys have seen through the entrepreneurs that you've worked with, and how do you get to embrace this notion of quote-unquote failure?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think failure is something that is taboo. It is something that we all have to kind of find our own internal way to get beyond and, move past it. And I can't imagine, kind of growing up in today's world where everything you do is publicly, made available forever. But specifically, as if you just look at my life journey, every step that I took, I kind of gave up something that was really great, that I absolutely loved, and did try to do something, that was really, really scary and would cost a lot of money, right? Whether it was leaving a great job to go to do business school, and then leaving another great job and selling the house and everything to move to India, and then giving up a great job to start something new. And I think the reason that I was willing to do that, it's pretty scary, right? To put your entire life savings on the line for something that you believe in, that you've never done before. But the reason that I was able to do that was because I had a great support infrastructure, and I had failed in several occasions in the past, and I knew that, you'll bounce back. That is just something we need to teach. We need to teach our children. We need to teach students, they need to learn through their jobs, and it's something that we do in my company. So, I'll give you a minor example. I have designers, and these designers are highly skilled designers for jewelry. Sometimes they make products that they cannot be produced in the way that they were envisioned. And it's a fail. It's a fail at the last mile, right? Which is a cost to company. So by enabling them to understand why we have to correct that earlier on in the process, I'm helping them innovate in their design thinking. So it's just one great example of how, helping people understand the failure and bouncing back rather than, tackling them down and, scolding them is a great way that the next time they produce a design, it will be that much stronger, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you have to break this sort of a risk gene into two segments. I truly believe that for people, probably there's a spectrum, but there are people who just have a high capacity for risk. I mean, what you're describing, Rebecca, is the example. And you can sort of spot them, because in my role at TIE, I saw lots and lots of startups, so you start to see some patterns. But on the other hand, so at the lower end of the spectrum, you have people who develop an innovation mindset, and this is where the relationship of education to entrepreneurship. And so you generate lots and lots of micro-entrepreneurs. And I think in the Indian context, that's more important, as I was saying earlier, than to create these sort of like, look for the sort of the unicorns and those kind of things. And so that's what we are seeing. Especially, while we are in the Indian context, the way I see it sitting in the US for the last 50 years, is that we have to unleash economic growth. I mean, you have 4 million, 5 million people coming to the workforce, and it's all going to happen at the bottom of the pyramid. It's not going to happen at the top. So I think we have to shift that conversation. But generally, I believe that maybe 10% of the population has very pronounced risk genes, where you can just spot it. I mean, the way they talk and the way they come across.
Rebecca spoke about the underlying need for grit and perseverance, and where does grit and perseverance come from? And I believe it comes from fundamentally deep in your gut, wanting to solve a particular problem. And the issue is that I meet so many young people who come to me and they say, I want to be an entrepreneur. And why? And partly it's because of people like Rashmi Bansal writing these books which tell the stories of successful entrepreneurs, and now everybody wants to be an entrepreneur for the sake of being an entrepreneur. Whereas you should be an entrepreneur because there is some problem of some customer that is really bothering you in the gut. Then if you fail once, you fail twice, you fail a third time, you will still continue to focus on solving that problem. And so how could we get people to stop thinking about entrepreneurship as an end, but entrepreneurship as a means to solve somebody's problem? And that's what will determine perseverance. That's what will determine grit. And that's what really we have to promote.
I cannot agree more with you. That's absolutely, entrepreneurship is a mindset, it's a lifestyle. Actually, I was at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Hyderabad. Yeah. Okay, what really blew me away when I was talking to young women in their early 20s, leaving well-paying jobs to start companies. Okay, I asked them, how do your parents feel about it? He says, it doesn't matter. They want to do it, and they are doing it, and they are very successful. They're determined. So I do not believe that there is a cultural, barrier to taking risks. Young women leaving their house, leaving good jobs, living by themselves, and starting companies. I think that's a sign that India is not really, held back. The other thing that I would like to point out is that, we talk about, knowledge economy and all that, but it's about entrepreneurial economies, right? We can talk a little bit more about it later, but the first entrepreneurial economy, was Silicon Valley, of course, right, after post-World War II. But if you really look at it, because of the brain drain in the 60s and the 70s and all that, I may exaggerate a little bit, but I want to make a point, right? The entrepreneurial economy happened in the 60s and 70s. The American population was about 140 million people, right? But it was built on the backs of Indians and Chinese. Let's not forget it, okay? They are the risk takers. They did all the heavy lifting, and they built the knowledge economy. So it's in their genes. Now, the middle class is global, right? And there are about 3 billion people, okay, in the new constituted into the middle class pool who, they earn less than $30 a day, PPP, the purchase price parity. The American business model, doesn't cater to this population. They cater to the other end of the spectrum who earn more than $50 to $60 a day PPP, right? So that's a white space. American business models, Silicon Valley business models, which are no longer entrepreneurial, what we call it is managerial capitalism. Their innovations are based on complementary innovations. They are built on platform innovations, right? But you cannot ignore half the world population. That's 3 billion people in the India, China, and Africa corridor. Okay, their needs are now, they are real, and the real talent builders, the Indians and the Chinese, they are here, and they're going to do it. And that includes, so I do not agree, sorry, that Indians are averse to taking risks. They are the risk takers, and they have a great track record.
In fact, that's a good point. My first startup that I did was completely predicated on the fact that I failed as an innovator prior to that. But the reason I was successful is because I had this fantastic fixed income equity portfolio at home, which is another way of saying my wife earned and had a salary coming in, and I went and did some experiments. But fascinating, diverse set of views. We're running out of time, but I do want to point out one interesting act, and this is where policy comes in. And given that all of you have dabbled both in India and US, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, which is the Bayh-Dole Act in the 80s, which was enacted in the US, which was a constitution of the Jeffersonian thought, as well as another thought which said, if innovation is to thrive from universities based off of federal government funding, meaning here's the government, it gives funding to a university, who has the rights to commercializing that IP? Does it belong to this larger society, or can it be owned by that institute or the individual? And the Bayh-Dole Act, you can read up on this, I won't touch upon it. But in India, a bill of this nature was introduced in 2008, and it was shunned. In the Indian context, can you guys throw some light on the ability of unleashing entrepreneurship, wherein there can be central government funding, but the ability for entrepreneurs from institutes to come out of it, especially for fundamental IP? So let's start with you, Gans, because you've done a lot of work at the grassroots level.
So there is a surprising amount of fascinating research that has happened. There's a part of the government called the Department of Biotechnology that created a Section 25 company called BIRAC. It throws 50 lakhs at just slideware, pure ideas. And there are some fascinating things. And if I describe these things, they just send a cold shiver down my spine because of how amazing they are. Like oral cancer, a cancerous tumor. If you excite it with a certain wavelength of UV light, it reflects another wavelength of UV light, which tells you that that's cancerous. So these guys come up with a small camera surrounded by UV LEDs. He puts it in your mouth, takes a picture, and then immediately you know if there is a cancerous or precancerous lesion in the mouth, and you know exactly where to biopsy for a confirmatory test. This was developed by Indian scientists right here using a 50 lakh biotech ignition grant from BIRAC. So if you provide that sort of high-risk funding to pure ideas, people have been able to actually create fascinating devices and applications. And at our portfolio at Wilgrow Medical Devices, we had about 10 such really exciting medical devices. The question is, what's the ecosystem to take that to market and grow that? You need 6 crores to take a medical product to market because of all the regulatory approvals, the clinical trials. You want to make sure that's absolutely safe. And there's a big gap between that because all the investors are saying, when you start earning revenue, then come to me and I'll fund you. But who's going to get him from that 50 lakh idea in the lab to where he actually has a certified product out there? And I think that's what's important. The government's been funding through this fund of funds a number of investors, but I think we need to focus on that missing chasm because if we don't, a lot of entrepreneurs aren't going to make it across that gap.
So let me remind you that back to government, the only successful example is Silicon Valley. I mean, for the most part, the fourth industrial revolution we're living through was a lot of defense money, DARPA and all that, coming to Silicon Valley, and that's how semiconductors were born, and email and all that stuff, they have roots. So my belief is, and by the way, learning from that, China is saying, okay, we're not just going to sort of throw stuff into it, but they're saying by 2025, we're going to be the world leaders in artificial intelligence. So I think governmental role in pure research, be very focused. is always very productive because it creates a national set of priorities. On the other hand, government running incubators and all this stuff is just, let me just give you a last example that I'm very big on, by the way, what's happening in India. And I believe in if you're going to follow the entrepreneurial model where, let 1,000 flowers bloom and a lot of them fail. And that's where the government has to be very careful that, because it's hard for governments to fail, you get into, legislature and everything else. But I'm seeing in Silicon Valley more and more, I'll give you an example, really the success story. Rajasthan government went through some kind of filtering process and took 100 college students and they brought them to Silicon Valley for 10 days. And to give them a world global exposure, it's kind of like a tea hub for Rajasthan or something. And I see across the globe things, and I have never seen 120-something, 19, 20 years old, who are just on fire and so articulate and so just passionate. I mean, those are the things that I feel like is going to change the world.
Jay, can I just disagree a little bit? So, everybody points to Silicon Valley and panders to the Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship, where you throw money at a problem, it's go big or go home, and 90% of them can fail, and that's fine. That might be okay where there's a lot of money to throw, such as the Silicon Valley. In India, I think if you were to prudently spend that money helping entrepreneurs build sound, solid businesses one step at a time, that's a far better use of our capital. There are a few game-changing ideas for which you have to do that. But do not force every entrepreneur to press the accelerator and just burn through the capital and either succeed or fail in 18 months. I mean, we have in the Stanford portfolio, and a number of them are in the room today, they've slowly built solid, profitable businesses that are employing people, that are creating impact. There is another model that is viable and sensible for the other 90%. Not for that top 10% game-changing type of a company. And we have to be sophisticated to differentiate between the two, create the instruments that generate returns, not the 10x, 20x return, but the 3x, 4x return, which is still good enough, but do it for larger numbers of companies. So I'd like to leave that thought.
Can I add something quickly? So I want to finish on a positive note very quickly, okay? I'm a big believer in India happening, in a big way in the entrepreneurship space because, if you really look at, if you take the world population, put it into two buckets, 20% is in the developed market and 80% in the emerging market, right? If you look at the world GDP, it's split 50-50 between the two, right? But if you look at, when people talk about knowledge economy or whatever, the thing that is connected to it is the middle class, right? So they need products and services. That's what knowledge economy does, right? So if you look and say who is catering, to the product and service needs of the world, if you look at S&P 500 as a basic barometer, right? What pops out is really striking. 90% of the revenue streams of the S&P 500, comes from the 20% developed bucket. Only 10% come from the other bucket, right? There's a huge disconnect. That was okay when they didn't have a middle class outside of the Western world. That is not the case anymore. As I said, there are 3 billion people, and the needs are real, right? And the Western business model, they're not geared up for it, right? So something has to give, and it's going to happen here. Thank you.
Now, let me sum it up and stitch it up. And I don't know if you have time for questions, but for the guys who raised their hands in the beginning, the entrepreneurs, here's your takeaway from this panel. And this is a quote from Einstein, and my fellow panelists will agree. What he said was, education is finally what is left behind after you go to school for many years and forget everything that's been taught to you. And what I mean by that is, in the country and the space and the time that we live in, the entrepreneurs, you will get a lot of gyan, including the panel that we just went through. The journey of entrepreneurship is your own. There's no script to it. You got to figure it out by yourself, and that's what makes it blissful as well as challenging at the same time. So thank you so much, folks.